guys. I think I know a good amount of you, but for those of you who don't know me, my name is Hayden. And hey, what's up? And you might see me sometimes in the back at the tech booth. I work here at the church in the creative department. I do videos and tech and lead small groups here in youth and just like hanging out here with you guys. And so we're trying something new this month. We're bringing in a couple of guest speakers like myself. If you guys were here last week, Chris Baca from our South Campus actually came in and delivered a really cool message. So I'm going to be kind of building off that as we continue in our series. But if you guys remember our series, and we have a little graphic up there, but our series this month is called Pause Mode, right? Everybody say pause mode. Pause mode, yeah. So just a little bit of a reintroduction, kind of catch you up on the series. It's really this idea about waiting, right? The waiting times in our life. And what those waiting periods look like. Waiting for life to happen, waiting for God to work in our lives, waiting for God's plan to play out for us, right? And the feelings we get surrounding those waiting periods, because it's tough to wait, right? The feelings of, feeling stuck or skeptical, or feeling like we're ready to give up on God's plan, or give up what He has for us, maybe take control ourselves, or listen to other people, or kind of do our own thing, right? And so last week, Chris talked about this idea about God being faithful. And I'm going to be continuing this week talking about the idea that while we're waiting, God is listening, right? So I'm going to build off of a key verse here. I'm going to read this verse first. It's out of 1 John 5:14, kind of sums up what I'm talking about. It says, "This is the confidence we have in approaching God, that if we ask anything according to His will, He hears us. And if we know what He hears, if we know that He hears us, whatever we ask, we know that we have what we have asked of Him." So what does waiting look like, right? Let's break it down practically. We wait every single day of our lives. Whether we think about it or not, we wait on something, right? We wait at restaurants, waiting for food or waiting to get a table. We wait in traffic, going from one place to another. We wait for something in school. We wait for a job. We wait for a relationship to unfold. We wait for a new video game or a new movie or something we're really excited about to come out. We wait for maybe a holiday or vacation, something that's coming up. Like I said at the beginning, there will always be waiting periods in our lives. And I think one of the things that I want to highlight today that's really important is this idea that we go from one waiting period to the next. And you might think that you're waiting for one thing, if you just get past that one stage, that one period, everything will be great, right? But what I want to point out today is that even when you get past one waiting period, you go into another waiting period. And so one of the things we're going to be looking at today is the idea of that there's something else on the horizon, and that when one waiting period is over, something else begins. And how do you make the most of those waiting periods? And so, something we really want to convey with this series is the idea that there's a plan and a purpose for your life, for the waiting periods, for everything that's going on. And that God is working and God is listening in the waiting. And what's even more important is that in those waiting times, I think we actually have a responsibility to take action and to make the most of the waiting periods, right? So for me, waiting looks like my job here at the church. I've been at Shoreline about 3 years now, and I did an internship, and then I did kind of an extended internship residency program here, and now I'm here full time. 3 years later, finally here, got the job I've been waiting for, right? But then now there's something else on the horizon. I'm looking at the next stage of my life. I'm in my 30s now. I'm looking at marriage and having a family, having kids down the road, and looking at what that next stage of life looks like. What does waiting look like for you guys? Waiting might look like waiting to graduate. It might look like waiting for a big event to come up, a sports event, something with your friends or your family. It might look like waiting for school to end, summer to start. It might look like wanting things to get back to normal. I think we can all relate to that idea of wanting things to go back to normal after this last year, right? So how does it make us feel when we're in those waiting periods? I know for me, it's not a good feeling, right? It's hard. Sometimes I'm skeptical, I'm unsure, I'm frustrated, I'm ready to give up, I'm ready to take control. I don't want to wait on God's plan. I want to do my plan, I want to do my thing, right? And sometimes I make the wrong decision. But today I'm hoping to highlight again how powerful and important these waiting periods are, and that they can be good or bad depending on what you do with them. And so, one of the things that you'll hear me say over and over today, just to kind of re-emphasize my point, is that in those waiting periods, God is with you throughout the entire time. He's present, He's working, and He's listening in every moment, no matter what, no matter how you respond, no matter what you do, He is there. So if you look at the Bible, there are multiple examples of waiting periods, because like I said, we all wait. Last week, we talked about the story of Abraham and Sarah, Chris talked about, also known as Abram and Sarai. They waited till they were long into their old age, so they were 100 years old to have a child. God had promised them this child, and they waited. Today I'm going to be building off another story about the Israelites, God's chosen people, how they were enslaved in Egypt for over 400 years until finally God stepped in. If you know the story, he sent Moses to rescue the people out of Egypt. Now I'll talk about those stories a little bit more in a moment, but another thing I want to point out is that sometimes in those times of waiting, it feels like our wishes, our prayers, what we want in life goes unheard sometimes. We might think that if God was listening to us, that those prayers, those wishes, they might happen faster, they might get answered sooner, right? But what I want to point out, and what I think is really important to remember, is that the speed at which God answers us has nothing to do with him not hearing us. In the end, God will provide. If you wait on his timing, if you wait for his plan to play out, there is something better at the end of it. We might not think so when we're in the waiting periods, but there is something better for us at the end. So looking again, talking about the Israelites, building out of Exodus, I'm going to read this verse. The Lord is talking to Moses, and he's recognizing the hardships that the Israelites are going through in Egypt. And he's talking in Exodus 3, verse 7. It says, "Then the Lord told him, I have certainly seen the oppression of my people in Egypt. I have heard their cries of distress because of their harsh slave drivers. Yes, I am aware of their suffering. So I have come down to rescue them from the power of the Egyptians and lead them out of Egypt into their own fertile and spacious land. It is a land flowing with milk and honey." Now this verse goes on. God is still talking to Moses, and he says, "Look, the cry of my people of Israel has reached me, and I have seen how harshly the Egyptians abuse them. Now go, for I am sending you to Pharaoh. You must lead my people out of Egypt." Again, I want to point out this idea of how difficult it can feel like when our answers, our prayers are not coming true or not being answered. And it's not always what we're looking for, right? It's not the plan we have for ourselves. It's not the timing we're wanting to wait for. It's God's plan. It's God's time. And it's sometimes as a result of this, we don't always respond in the right way or choose to follow what God has for us or what timeline God's laid out for us. So I've already mentioned this idea of how hard it can be, and that there's temptation in the waiting to give up, right? To take control, to do things ourselves, to not follow God's plan. And so I want to pose the question and hopefully answer what it looks like when we do those things. How does it turn out when we don't follow the plan, when we don't follow his timing? Well, if you look at the Israelite story, it's a great example of the Israelites waiting for 400 years to be rescued out of slavery. And then Moses went in and he brought them out of Egypt. And if you know how the story goes, it goes on to talk about how they were on their journey to this promised land that God had promised them and talked to them about. And even then they began to doubt God's promise for them. And they became impatient with the waiting. And as a result, they ended up wandering out in the desert, in the wilderness for 40 years, right? Even after God had rescued them from slavery, they still doubted him and they still chose to make a mistake. If you think about last week with Abraham and Sarah, it's a great example of how God eventually gave them the son that he had always promised them. But if you remember the story, they actually became impatient at one point. And Sarah offered up one of her maids as another wife to Abraham so that he could produce a son, produce an heir. And as that story goes on, they had a son, and Sarah actually ended up mistreating the son, mistreating the maid, forcing them out of their home. And the story goes on even further to show that Abraham's two sons, the one with the maid and the future one he would have with Sarah, ended up battling each other and hating each other for many, many years to follow. Yet another example of people that did not wait for God, did not respond positively to the period they were put in, right? So what I'm trying to point out, I hope that you're getting from this, is that I believe we have a responsibility, a duty to make the most of these waiting periods in our lives. To see it as an opportunity for growth versus a burden. To have faith, to trust God, to trust his plan and his timing. Instead of becoming impatient and taking action and responding in a negative way that displeases God, I think it's important that we respond in a positive way. And ultimately be okay with the answers God has for us, the plan he lays out for us, and the timing, and whatever that looks like, right? So I want to bring this point, these stories, a little closer to home for me for a minute. I've shared my testimony with some of you guys in small groups and other places. But believe it or not, I actually struggled very heavily with drug addiction for over 10 years. I'm in my 30s now. My 20s were not a very pretty time. And when I think back in that waiting period, waiting for life to change, waiting for life to get better, I was sitting in my addiction, my depression, my anxiety, and my empty life for so long, ignoring any plans God had for me. And I look back at how I responded in that waiting period. I wasn't asking for help. I was continuing to sit around and make bad choices, give into addiction, give into temptation. And the funny thing was, looking back, God was with me the whole time, right? I just wasn't accepting that help. I wasn't following his plan for my life. And so finally, I chose to ask for help. And by God's grace, just like the stories in the Bible, the stories we're talking about today, he offered me a chance at redemption, a better life. And I was forced to look at my choices, look at the life I was leading, and I was forced to change things, to do things differently, and to live a new life under God's plan, focusing less on myself and more of God, right? So again, I'm here to share a testament, to bring you these stories, and to remind you guys that there is a purpose for the waiting. It might seem hard, it might seem frustrating, you might have a million questions, and that's okay. But God has a plan, and he is listening, and he is working constantly, even in the waiting, especially in the waiting. If we but follow his guidance, have patience, and make the most of these waiting seasons, I promise you there is light at the end of the tunnel. There is something better for you on the other side. Now, as I close these Bible stories, looking back at the good that came out of them, when you think about the Israelites, they were freed, they were taken out of slavery, and yes, they made the wrong choice and began to question God. But if you follow the story, God actually eventually sent Jesus to die on the cross to redeem his people. If you look at the story of Abraham and Sarah, yes, they made a mistake and tried to go their own way. But in the end, after they were patient, God provided Isaac, the son that would go on to do amazing things. So before I close, I want to highlight these two verses real quick. And they kind of sum up kind of what that light on the other side looks like. It sums up our love for God. This first verse is coming out of Psalms, and the writer of this psalm is expressing his love, praising God for what he has done for him. So in Psalms 116 it says, I love the Lord, for he heard my voice. He heard my cry for mercy, because he turned his ear to me. I will call upon him as long as I live. The cords of death entangled me. The anguish of the grave came over me. I was overcome by distress and sorrow. Then I called on the name of the Lord. Lord, save me. The Lord is gracious and righteous. Our God is full of compassion. The Lord protects the unwary. When I was brought low, he saved me. I just love the poetry in that. Because I lived that, right? Like, I was at my low, and I cried out to God, and God saved me. He provided. And when I look at how my life is today compared to where it was back then, things have drastically changed. And that doesn't mean I don't still struggle. That doesn't mean I'm not still stuck in waiting periods. It just means that I'm learning from some of my mistakes, and I'm learning to make the most of life, learning to make the most of the waiting periods, and try to live out what I feel like God has planned for me. I have this tattoo on my arm. I've got my sleeve rolled down so I can't show you, but I have this tattoo on my arm. It's another verse, the last verse I want to highlight. It's out of Matthew 6:33. And it says, seek the kingdom of God above all else. Live righteously, and he will provide everything you need. This sentiment is echoed constantly throughout the Bible. This idea of seeking God above everything, of offering our bodies as a living sacrifice, seeking him first and letting him provide. Because I promise you, he will in the end. It might seem hard. Like I said, we're definitely going to mess up. We're definitely going to make mistakes. We're definitely going to grab that steering wheel and take control at times. But it's important to recognize that. And it's important to learn to make the positive choice and respond in a positive way. Put God at the center of our lives. So as I close, I just want to remind you guys, waiting is hard. I will admit that it is hard, and I've waited my whole life. That's what we do. But God is always there. He's always listening. And he's always ready to do amazing things in my life if I should give him the opportunity. And so I want to ask you guys a few questions as we close out. When looking at this idea of God's plan, God's timing, the waiting periods, God can do amazing things. But what are you guys doing? Are you making the most of these waiting periods? Or are you trying to follow your own plan? What does your relationship with God look like? Are you actively seeking him and asking him to reveal his plan for you? Are you helping and serving other people or part of a community? As I said at the beginning, life is full of waiting. Are you going to sit by and just miss the opportunity? Are you going to take positive action and turn to God? Now, next week, Haley's going to close with the idea that God never gives up on us, so we shouldn't give up on him. I want you guys to remember this week, if you take away anything, it's God's timing, not ours. And are you willing to let that plan and that timing play out? Let's pray. Dear God, we just thank you so much for this day and this opportunity for us to come together in your house and worship and learn and grow and be in community. And we thank you for the opportunities you give us to learn and to grow in the waiting, to make the most of them and to turn to you and to turn to your plan and your timing for our lives. We just thank you for the opportunities. We thank you for everything you're doing in our life, and we ask you to continue to show us what that plan is you have for us so we can most glorify you. We thank you, we love you. It's in your name we pray. Amen.